Beijing, capital of China, the country with the largest population on Earth. Beijing is one of the world's great cities, and it was made capital of China by a great man. That man was Kublai Khan. Kublai declared himself Great Khan, the supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire, at his palace of Xanadu in 1260. But his main interest was in China, where he reigned until 1294 and founded the Yuan dynasty. This meant he also became a major figure in the history of China.
Kublai Khan was an extremely significant figure in the course of Chinese history because he was the first significant non-Chinese ruler to rule over the entire Chinese empire, and more than that, had aspirations in effect to try and rule the entire world.
Kublai Khan was the grandson of the legendary Mongol warlord Genghis Khan, who carved out a vast empire across Asia and the Middle East at the beginning of the 13th century. Like his grandfather, Kublai crushed his enemies with brute force. Yet he ruled his own lands peacefully, setting up governments, creating systems of taxation, and promoting culture and commerce. He made Beijing the capital of the biggest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the shores of the China Sea to the River Danube in Europe, and from Siberia to the Indian Ocean. But his greatest achievement was the unification of China, a unification that survives to this day. And although he reigned over 700 years ago, his story is one that still has great significance.
The reason why Kublai Khan is of interest today is because Kublai Khan ruled a great multicultural society, a great multicultural empire, and he presided over a global economy. And this was globalization in the Middle Ages, and again, his empire incorporated many different cultures and peoples, and he was able to unify them, bring them together, and do so successfully.
So Kublai Khan was clearly a man of vision, but what else do we know about him? The Venetian traveller Marco Polo, who lived in Kublai's court for more than 20 years, described him as a man of middle height with a figure of just proportion and a face that was somewhat red, which may have resulted from his love of food and alcohol. But he was also capable of extreme violence, barbarity, and cruelty. He carved out his great empire with one battle after another, and even though his military career started quite late in his life, his skill in combat was second to none. But there was another, very different side to his character. Throughout his reign, the wise Khan, as he was known, courted the most sophisticated, intellectual, scientific, and artistic minds of the day. And he was very practical, recognizing the benefits that freedom of trade and effective taxation would bring.
In terms of practical changes, one of the big things that you would have seen if you lived through his rule was a massive increase in public works. For instance, China's canal system was increased during his time through massive use of forced labor. This meant that grain and other important agricultural goods could be transported up and down the country much more conveniently, without having, for instance, to use the often slightly dangerous and pirate-ridden seas on the China coast. Another innovation of the period, and one that would have great significance later, was the introduction of paper currency, banknotes.
To understand the full significance of this, we need to know more about the Mongol culture that Kublai Khan came from. Kublai's grandfather, Genghis Khan, was one of the most violent men in history. In just 2 decades in the early 13th century, his forces carved out the biggest empire in world history. The Mongolian tribes he led originated from the steppe grasslands in the shadows of the Altai Mountains in the southwest of the modern state of Mongolia. Mongols were a nomadic race. They had no towns. Instead, they lived in magnificent tented settlements. It was a harsh existence, and it produced a race of men and women who were extremely tough. In 1206, Genghis Khan was proclaimed universal ruler of these people of the steppes, and he set about organizing his military resources. In a great flurry of violence, Genghis Khan's campaigns extended from the Black Sea to Korea. Their brutality was legendary.
If you resisted the Mongols, you were in deep trouble, because once they had laid siege to your town and taken it, you might find that, for instance, every man would have his head cut off. There were famous tales, semi-mythical perhaps, but still very indicative of piles of heads like cannonballs being found in conquered cities. Or they might exercise arbitrary terror, for instance, decide that every man over a certain height in the city was going to be executed, or that everybody in town's ears were going to be cut off and placed in a big pile. And it was well known also that by surrendering, you could avoid these sorts of horrors. Therefore, the Mongols managed through psychological terror and rumours of how brutal they were, often to force cities to surrender without even fighting, because they were afraid of the alternative if they actually tried to resist.
But as the Mongol Empire spread across Asia, there was one major obstacle they couldn't overcome. The Sung Empire of southern China had over 50 million people and vast resources. For years, the Mongols tried to conquer this giant of the south, but were unsuccessful. It was going to take a warrior of very special abilities to overcome the resistance of the Sung dynasty that ruled southern China. This man was Kublai Khan, but it was to be many years before he was to get the chance to prove himself. Kublai was born in Mongolia in 1215, when his grandfather Genghis was at the height of his power. His father Tolui was a coarse military man, the youngest of Genghis's 4 sons by his favorite wife. Kublai's childhood and early career were unspectacular. They gave little hint of how influential he was to become.